Hello, World History, and welcome to World War One, Unit 10, Part 2. You might remember the start of World War One happened as a result of basically alliances and nationalism. I guess nationalism first, then alliances. You might remember, for example, that Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, was assassinated by Serbian nationalists in the summer of 1914, and that's what propelled Austria to declare war on Serbia. From there was a chain reaction where Russia joined Serbia, and then the Russians' allies joined with Russia, and Austria-Hungary's allies joined with it. And before you know it, we had a war between the Central Powers of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire versus the Allied powers of Great Britain, France, and Russia. On the Western Front, this is the part of the war which is basically between Germany and France. The Germans had this idea called the Schlieffen Plan. They thought that they should knock France out of the war first and then deal with Russia. Russia is going to be much more slower to attack Germany than France would be. And so the Germans attack France through Belgium, and the British bring their army onto French soil, and the French and the British together are fighting against the Germans in the West. Fighting broke down into a bloody stalemate pretty early in the war when the Germans failed to take over Paris and end the war quickly. And from there, a whole bunch of trenches were built, dug essentially on either side. And from there, really the lines really didn't change very much. There were lots of these kind of foolish assaults or foolish battles between the various sides. Two infamous battles from 1916 were the Battle of Verdun, in which the Germans were attacking the French, and the Battle of the Somme, in which the British were attacking the Germans. And you can see that crazy numbers of soldiers became casualties, that is to say, killed or wounded or captured. And so it's 500,000 soldiers from the Battle of Verdun on each side, so 1,000,000 men, and then the Battle of the Somme too. That's 1,000,000 men who became casualties in 5 months. Battle of the Somme is infamous for the British Army losing 600,000 soldiers in one day of fighting. Once again, that's killed, captured, or wounded. Once again, the reason for the very large number of casualties is that the kind of fighting that was going on in Western Europe or on the Western Front is called trench warfare. And in order to not be killed by artillery pieces or by machine guns or rifle fire, soldiers dug into the ground and very early in the war, and they basically created these trenches that ended up to be about 400 miles long from the border of Switzerland all the way up to the English Channel. And then each and every one of those, each side also built numerous trenches going back. So really each side had 400 miles of trenches, multiplied by 3 or 4 trenches on each side. And between the trenches, you had barbed wire, you had machine guns, and very frequent shelling by these large artillery pieces in the so-called no man's land between the lines of trenches. And the trenches were really a terrible place to fight from or out of, and they're a terrible place to live as well. Very dangerous when you are attacking, very dangerous when you're defending, but also just dangerous living there. Pretty terrible conditions when the weather turned bad. It could be muddy and it could be snowy. It could be really pretty bad. Here's a few pictures and a graphic of the trenches themselves, and you can see that actually they were fairly well built, and a good way to save somebody's life would be to hang out just behind the trench and not jump out of the trench and attack across no man's land. But of course, every once in a while, the soldiers were ordered to do so. Here's some additional trench pictures. The top left is a guy kind of peeking over the trench. Um, Bottom right or middle right are soldiers who are about to jump out of their trench and attempt to run across no man's land. And the nasty picture of feet right there, that's trench foot, which is a disease that you get from really not taking good care of your feet, keeping them in boots all the time, not taking them off and washing them and so on. It really creates or disfigures your feet terribly, and basically you would become a casualty as well if you got trench foot. On the Eastern Front, this is the fight that takes place between Austria, Hungary, Germany, and then their enemy Russia. It's actually not quite. There aren't quite so many trenches there. It's a much larger space to fight in, and it really doesn't go well for Russia. While in the West, it's a bit of a draw. In the East, the Russians are really losing from the very beginning of the war until they jump out of the war in 1917 or 1918. And the reason for that is that Russia is really not as industrialized as Germany is, or Germany was, or even as industrialized as Austria-Hungary. And so they were constantly short on food and the supplies that they needed to fight the war. And this creates a very large number of casualties on the Russian side, and kind of destroys their morale, and gets them to want to overthrow their leader and jump out of the war. Already by 1916 or so, Russia's war effort was really near collapse, and we'll talk about that in the next lecture. World War One really is a global conflict. It's not just being fought in Europe, it's fought in Asia. The Japanese actually were helping out the British and the French and the Russians against the Germans in China, for example. And there are colonial armies in Africa that were fighting on behalf of the imperial powers. A colonial army fighting for Germany, or colonial armies fighting for the British and the French against the German colonial army. One of the more famous campaigns that happens against the Ottoman Empire is when Britain landed a bunch of troops on Ottoman soil trying to seize the capital of the Ottoman Empire, which was Istanbul. And this attack failed miserably, unfortunately for the Allies. And about 250,000 or so, mostly British or British Empire troops, people from New Zealand, people from Australia, became casualties as a result of that. And the person who championed the idea to do this, Winston Churchill, is really quite humiliated and embarrassed by this. Later on, you will see him being the leader of Britain during World War II. World War One is called a total war because countries really had to devote all of their resources and industry to the war effort. And if they didn't, then they were sure to lose the war. They would run out of bullets, they would run out of artillery pieces, they would run out of food, and so on. And unlike other wars or previous wars where, of course, men fought and were trying to work in factories and so on to supply the troops, women actually take a lot of responsibility for working in jobs that they had never worked before. Of course, once again, this is an industrial war, and so factories are very important to it. And this does a lot for eventually for women's rights, because people found out that women could do the exact same jobs that men could do, and so women's work, although it doesn't obviously completely go away, at least the idea that there's work that men do and work that women do is starting to be shaken. And there's also quite a bit of rationing that goes on during the war, that with millions of men being taken off of their farms to fight in the war, you had women, or you had children, or you had old people who were taking over for them. And so the amount of agricultural production fell, and that's why you needed rationing, or all of the trade disruptions that were happening at this point in time too. Nations weren't getting what they could get from their colonies previously. And then also propaganda is a really big part of the war, as each and every government tries to convince their people that they are the right side of the war, and that the enemy is the wrong side of the war, and that the enemy is hopelessly evil and has to be defeated. There were a number of new technologies used in war. Some of them are kind of older technologies, but are used for a different purpose. A good example of that is barbed wire, which of course is used to keep cattle in one place or another. Well, barbed wire was used to slow down troops who were trying to advance through no man's land and attack the enemy. And airplanes go through some pretty amazing developments at this point in time as well. At the very beginning of the war, they're very basic, very crude. They're not even really armed with machine guns or bombs. And by the time the war ends, you have huge fleets of airplanes that can bomb the enemy, or that can machine gun the enemy or each other in the air. There's also flamethrowers, which is kind of a weapon that shoots uh, liquefied gasoline or petroleum at the enemy, and it's burn people to death and attack trenches using this kind of more modern weapon. Hand grenades or grenades, little bombs that are launched even from rifles, become something that get used in the war quite a bit. Poison gas is also used for the first time in a war, and many men were their skin was burned, or their lungs were charred, or they died, gasping for breath due to various kinds of poison gases that were being used. And of course, they come up with gas masks at different points in time, and it kind of overcomes the poison gas threat, but it's still a very nasty weapon. You saw the machine gun from the last unit being used on people around the world, and now the Europeans are using them upon each other, and that's creating a large number of casualties. The giant artillery pieces that aren't really even at on the battlefield, they're behind the battlefield and they're firing sometimes from a mile away or so on. Those actually create a huge number of casualties as well. And there's also submarines or U-boats, which brings the United States into the war. In fact, the United States jumps into the war in April of 1917. And the official excuse is that the Germans started to sink ships with their submarines without giving any kind of warning, and the United States was angry about that because the United States was trying to trade with Britain and France with ships, and so we declare war. There's also a note that was sent between Germany to Mexico, saying that Mexico should join Germany during World War One if the United States got involved in the war, and we didn't like that very much, that they were plotting against us. And then there was also all kinds of economic ties to the Allies, that the Americans sold the British and the French lots and lots of military equipment during the war, and if they lost the war, then we probably wouldn't get our money back. So it's another reason to jump in the war. The effects of World War One are really quite horrendous. About 10 million soldiers from all different sides were killed. About 20 million more, mostly young men, were wounded, many of them crippled so that they could never work again. Millions of civilians died from the war. Many of them, or some of them, had starved to death or had gotten diseases. In fact, after the war, or at the very end of the war, a Spanish flu, so-called Spanish flu, breaks out, and that kills even many more people than died in the war. And you can imagine the legacy of hatred and intolerance and extreme nationalism that occurs after 4 years or so of fighting. The economic cost of the war, of course, was extreme as well. The war is estimated to have cost around $350 billion when dollars were when that was a large amount of money, and international trade suffered. There was very little trading going on, especially with the submarine threat and blockades, naval blockades, and so on. Another thing that happened, which is a major thing that happens in world history, is when the communists took control of Russia, which once again we'll talk about in the next lecture. And even the victorious countries, the ones who won the war, were in bad economic shape. They had spent crazy amounts of money fighting this war, and it's really hard to get back on your feet with that kind of debt. The end of the war is brought around by the United States jumping into the war and our president, President Wilson, coming up with an idea called Wilson's 14 points. And it was an idea that the world would be a better place after World War One, and had ideas like self-determination for colonies. In other words, colonies would be allowed to become independent and not controlled by the Europeans. The 14 points tried to overcome, the idea of secret alliances and so on. And so President Wilson suggested no secret treaties and freedom of the seas. That has to do with the threat that the submarines posed, or the blockades that had been done during the war. We basically wanted to be able to sell stuff to whoever we wanted. And then the idea, too, for a League of Nations, or an organization where nations could get together and talk about avoiding war rather than going to war. Unfortunately, Wilson's 14 points don't really get adopted. Great Britain and France wanted to punish Germany more harshly than the Americans did. We had only been fighting for a short period of time, and they'd been fighting for a longer period of time. And so the Treaty of Versailles is the treaty that ends the war. It says that the Germans were completely guilty, completely responsible for the war, and because of that, the Germans lost their colonies, and they had to pay reparations, or kind of a gigantic fine, to the Allies in order to end the war. And the United States actually never jumped into or joined the League of Nations, the thing that President Wilson suggested. And so that never really becomes a very good organization for preventing the next war. If you have any questions, just ask me, and I thank you for watching this and taking notes.